Chapter 6 Seeing a Light Decision Making. Morning arrived with the clearest, calmest weather in days. The chill in the air was invigorating. After choking down a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal, our crew began gathering up their gear and putting the camp in order for our anticipated departure. We worked as a unit, without much discussion, everyone taking on tasks that needed to be done. The sun was over the trees when we finally left our assembled gear at the cabin and walked to the beach to wait, hoping our preparations and anticipation weren't in vain. "I wonder what the weather is like back home," said Earl. "I wonder if they'll even realize we're still out here." Joe laughed, his broad smile stretching his mustache to the edge of his cheeks. "Who knows, they may even be celebrating our absence." "Whatever they're thinking," I added, "it would seem that our fate will be an outcome of someone else's decision now." Susan gazed out across the water with an expression of concern. "I just hope that someone makes good decisions." "What do you think she means about someone being a good decision maker?" Earl asked me a few minutes later as he reorganized his day pack. "You know, Earl, I've been to training sessions that went through the mechanics of rational decision making. I know about best management practice, recommendations, and all that stuff. But I don't often implement all the steps. I probably need to become more disciplined about that." "It's hard to take a cookbook approach to making decisions in real life," Becky pointed out. "My experiences never seem to work out quite like the role playing scenarios in those training sessions or in neat textbook diagrams." "Very true," I replied. "The conversations we've had over the last day or so have really brought home some important points with respect to approaching decisions." "For me, too," said Susan. "I had a lot of ideas going through my head last night as I was mulling over our discussions. One particular thing that struck me was that relevance of some of these points. One particular thing that struck me was the relevance of some of the points to the AIM, adaptive impact management, approach that I mentioned yesterday." "Good," Pet said enthusiastically. "I'd like to hear more about that." Susan continued, "It struck me that focusing on impacts and scales of an issue, alone with understanding limits and capacities, or along with it, could really lead to better outcomes of decisions," she continued. "AIM, if I'm remembering it right, talks about defining objectives in terms of impacts, being explicit about scale of the problems and decisions, considering limits to the system, and describing trade-offs in terms of impacts, all the while keeping stakeholders focused on understanding the consequences of any given management alternative in terms of yielding desired results." "Why don't you find the cure for the common cold while you're at it?" Joe teased. "There's that optimism flaring up again," I kidded back. "It's not like a stroll in the park, Joe. In fact, it's a huge challenge, but something attainable, I think." "You left out two things," Pat said. "Monitoring and evaluation. You need to monitor the outcomes of decisions and evaluate progress toward goal accomplishments so you can test assumptions and adapt approaches. Without those last two steps, it's hard to learn from the last decision you made." "The difficulty with decision making in wildlife management," Becky pointed out, "is that we can't rely solely on biological information, even though that typically is our primary knowledge base. I think one of our most important responsibilities as managers is to integrate human dimensions into biological considerations." Pat gave his nice affirmation, and the rest of us nodded. Someone then started to speak, but was interrupted by the loud croak and piercing cry of a gull floating nearby on the water and keeping a watchful, greedy eye on us in case one of our number had people food to fling in its direction. For a minute or two, all of us silently stared back at the rude bird. "You know," I finally said, "one difficulty we all seem to have in management is the tendency to skip over the process of establishing fundamental objectives. And then we get consumed in an argument about enabling objectives, the more immediate pieces and how to do them. We focus on what road to take and too often don't look ahead to make sure we all agree on the final destination. It's the destination that should determine the best road and the needed stops along the way, the means or enabling objectives. It's difficult to depart from the way we have approached management decisions for a long time, decisions that produced a strong dose of "we know what is best for you" attitude toward the public. "It would be a whole lot easier," said Susan, "if I could set the objectives, but as we discussed earlier, I guess it's not entirely my role to determine objectives unilaterally." "Remember Joe's bear case?" Pat asked. "The involvement of stakeholders in identifying impacts was essential to identifying management goals." Earl nodded in agreement. "And based on our experience," he said, "it seems no one but the stakeholder is capable of weighing the impacts identified." "Well," Becky added, "I've had quite a bit of training in decision-making, too. At first, it struck me that the models I learned would apply to any situation. It didn't take me long to find out that no model works in all situations." "Right," I agreed. "And maybe there's no such thing as a perfect decision. It could be that we need to accept the reality of decisions that are simply good enough." "I am convinced that engaging stakeholders in decision-making is necessary and valuable," Joe observed, "but it sure doesn't make the decision-making process any easier." He stood up and skipped a few stones across the water. "I agree," I said, "but I do think that stakeholder involvement makes decisions more durable, less likely to be challenged, and more likely to withstand challenges that do crop up." "For me, that's a key point," Earl added, stooping to gather some stones of his own. "You don't want to be in the business of revisiting every single decision you make over and over again. Sort of like my hound chasing his tail." He punctuated this point by tossing an impressive skipper. Pat whistled appreciatively at Earl's skill. "All in the wrist," Earl responded. "It's an art, like decision-making." "For certain," I said, appreciative of Earl's metaphor as well as his stone-skipping talent. "Anyway, to make management decisions durable, you need to focus on the problem in terms of wildlife impacts and then develop clear objectives from that. After you do that, you need a good range of alternatives. I think we are inclined to rely on the same old tools and sometimes are blind to new and innovative options. We need to think broadly and to identify and understand the consequences of novel alternatives. That can be interesting work." Becky, now trying her hand at skipping stones, replied, "We ought to be able to describe strengths and weaknesses of alternatives to our stakeholders and help them make trade-offs as well." "Yes," I agreed. "It's all the uncertainties, the limits of our knowledge and understanding of consequences of management actions that we need to deal with. We need to anticipate risks and make sure the public and other decision makers understand them. A wildlife manager's credibility can be bruised badly if these potential risks aren't explained." Earl took a break from filling the bay with small, flat stones and talked about how decisions can accumulate over time, how the effects of them can be magnified. "We need to do a bit of crystal balling to plan for how decisions can be linked over time," he said. "So, Earl," I said, "getting back to your question about who's a good decision maker, I'd say that a good one is a person who can integrate biological and social science knowledge, involve stakeholders, weigh their input, avoid or resolve conflicts, facilitate a process that identifies impacts, translate it into a fundamental objective, and then identify enabling objectives and acceptable, feasible management actions." "Nice sentence, Melville," said Pat. There followed 1 or 2 seconds of silence, then an explosion of laughter from all of us at Pat's unexpected wit. Susan laughed so hard she got hiccups, and that took the comic relief to another level. When the mirth found control and mellowed, I got back on subject. I can't imagine that any one person will be able to deal with all the complexities of such an involved decision making process. An individual responsible for facilitating a decision making process must realize that he or she cannot be a Lone Ranger. A host of skills is required, and the manager must be willing to seek that expertise, to hire it, contract it, beg, borrow, or steal it, just like our little group. We have our individual strengths and weaknesses. As if I purposefully intended it to be an audible emphasis, my first attempt at a stone toss kerplunked. A case in point, I said in mock dejection. Collectively, though, we are an effective team. If we hadn't been willing to rely on each other over the past couple of weeks, we wouldn't have had such a rewarding field experience. The same goes for making decisions. Get strength where you need it, and don't try to go it alone unless you have all the skills for the situation at hand. Right, Joe agreed. The bear situation I described definitely involved a team of people. I was fortunate to have support from a lot of folks outside of my agency, particularly state and university people, all through the process. I couldn't have done it alone. The process would have overwhelmed me. So, how did the process you used and the concepts you drew back in the cabin differ from the AIM approach Susan outlined? Funny you should ask that, Joe replied. Wisecracks aside, I was trying to do a mental comparison. I think there are a lot of similarities, but we more or less stumbled into the approach we followed in my case. There was nothing rigorous or systematic at the start. I'd like to learn more about this AIM approach because we're not done yet. My agency asked me to develop recommendations and make a presentation to our senior staff about processes similar to what I went through. They must have liked what you did, Becky observed. Whether or not you followed the textbooks in your approach. I guess so, he said, smiling at the irony. But I'm not really comfortable laying out what we went through as a blueprint, because it was mainly a product of trial and error. Or intuition, with some luck thrown in for good measure. But those are things I can't count on. So in responding to my boss's request, I'd like to lay out a more systematic approach with a more theoretical base and more rigor to it than what was essentially an educated guess learning experience for me. Basically, I didn't know what I was doing, but we came up with something that worked. My agency now sees me as an expert in this, but I was just one part of the team. I'm no expert, and that's why I'm struggling with figuring out what to present. I think a large part of why I volunteered for this field assignment was avoidance behavior. You ought to take the team approach for this assignment and hook up with Susan to get the scoop on AIM, Earl suggested, gesturing towards Susan, who glanced up with a look in surprise. Maybe that's the model you can present, he added. I'd be glad to work with you, Susan said, offering her assistance to Joe. But I'm not sure I can explain all the intricacies. I think Pat and Becky could help because they have a background in some of the concepts that I lack. I'd like to learn more about how to apply AIM myself, so I'd be willing to give it a go if they'd participate too. Pat was obviously pleased to be in a position to help his more senior colleagues. I'd be willing to chip in because I'd like to learn more firsthand about applying these ideas to real issues, he replied. Likewise, said Becky. That would be great, Joe said. Susan, if you could email us the references and any other material when we get back, maybe we can start communicating on this. Susan, is there anything in particular that you want Pat and me to focus on? Susan said she'd look over the materials at her office on AIM, then send them to Pat and Becky. It would be good if, after you guys look it over, you could tell us how you think you can help. I'll send the same materials to you too, Joe, she added. It would be nice if we could actually get together at some point after we've digested this, Joe suggested. Do any of you go to the regional meetings or a national wildlife conference? I'm hoping to present a paper on my graduate work at the next regional event, Pat replied. I've gone to a few of those. I try to attend if budgets and workload don't prevent it. I was going to request travel to attend, but it's a long shot. My agency is chronically strapped for travel funds, Becky replied. I might be able to go too, said Earl. I could probably swing it, I said. I'm usually involved in committee meetings at both events. I'd hate to be left out of the fun. Wow, Joe exclaimed. You might actually all be there. We could have a reunion of sorts. It would be a great opportunity to follow up on this. Would you guys keep Earl and me in the loop on your efforts to develop the meat for Joe's presentation so we're all on the same page? I said. I don't know about Earl, but I'm interested in learning more about applications of this AIM concept. I'd definitely like to learn more, Earl agreed. Great, said Joe, clapping his hands together. We got a game plan, and Susan will kick it off via email after we get back. And you know what? Said Susan. I hear an otter. A what? Said Earl with a startled expression. An otter. I think I hear our plane. The rest of us strained to hear over the slurp of low waves against the abrupt shoreline. Who are you? Radar O'Reilly? Joe asked, lapsing into the smart aleck. We cocked our heads like syncopated magpies, and fully 10 seconds later, the drone of our plane, a twin-engine otter, was plainly heard by all. You're amazing, said Earl, turning to Susan. So was this, she answered.